The room fell silent as the president spoke. Not the silence of agreement, but the silence of disbelief. It was April 1961, and inside the White House, John F. Kennedy had just uttered words that no one present expected to hear. The operation was failing. Cuban exiles were pinned down on a distant beach, their ammunition dwindling, their air cover non-existent. And the men who had designed this mission, the planners from the Central Intelligence Agency, the admirals of the Joint Chiefs, were telling the young president that without immediate American military intervention, the entire venture would collapse into catastrophe. Kennedy refused. Admiral Arleigh Burke pressed harder. American destroyers waited just over the horizon. Jets sat fueled and armed on carrier decks. A single order could turn the tide. The brigade could be saved. Castro could be toppled. But Kennedy refused again. What unfolded in those hours defied every assumption held by the men in that room. They had built their plan on a foundation of certainty. Certainty that no American president would permit a public humiliation. Certainty that when the moment of crisis arrived, escalation would follow as surely as night follows day. But they were wrong. Why would a president of the United States allow an operation to fail when he possessed the means to save it? Why was escalation the default expectation? What did Kennedy see that the CIA did not? This was not weakness, this was fear of something far worse. To comprehend Kennedy's refusal, we must first discard the notion that the Cold War consisted of separate, isolated crises. In Kennedy's mind, the world of 1961 formed a single interconnected battlefield where every action reverberated across continents. Cuba was never just Cuba. From the earliest days of his presidency, John Kennedy was fixated not on Havana, but on Berlin. The divided German city represented the most dangerous fault line of the Cold War, the place where American and Soviet forces faced each other directly, where the margin for miscalculation was measured in meters rather than miles. Berlin was not merely a symbol, it was a tripwire, and Kennedy understood something that many of his advisors seemed to forget. The Soviets possessed the same capacity for linkage that he did. In the logic of Cold War symmetry, aggressive American action in one theater invited Soviet response in another. An American invasion of Cuba, a Soviet-aligned nation in Washington's sphere of influence, provided Moscow with perfect justification for its own aggressive action against Berlin, a Western-aligned city in Moscow's sphere of influence. The mathematics were brutally simple. The United States might successfully liberate Cuba from Castro's government, and then Soviet armor might roll toward West Berlin, and the world would discover whether nuclear deterrence was a strategy or a suicide pact. Kennedy grasped this linkage with an almost obsessive clarity. In private conversations, the same theme recurred. What happens in Berlin if we move in Cuba? The question was not rhetorical. It was the question that all other questions orbited around. There was another ghost haunting Kennedy's calculations. The ghost of Budapest in 1956. 5 years before the Bay of Pigs, Hungarian citizens had risen against their Soviet-backed government in a spontaneous revolution that captured the imagination of the Western world. The United States did nothing. Soviet tanks crushed the uprising with methodical brutality. Thousands of Hungarians died. For Kennedy, Hungary demonstrated what happened when rhetoric outpaced reality. When a superpower encouraged rebellion it was unwilling to support. When brave men and women staked their lives on promises that evaporated at the first sign of genuine risk. He was determined not to create an American Hungary. He would not encourage Cuban exiles to believe that the United States would bail them out when the operation turned difficult. He would not make promises he could not keep. Kennedy drew a line that he communicated with unmistakable clarity. There would be no direct American military intervention, not if the landing faltered, not if the brigade was surrounded, not if the entire operation collapsed. Almost no one believed him. While Kennedy calculated linkages and worried about Berlin, another war was being planned in the offices controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency. This was a different kind of war, with different assumptions and a fundamentally different understanding of how success would be achieved. To understand the CIA's confidence, One must travel back 7 years to Guatemala, where the agency had orchestrated what seemed like a perfect covert operation. In 1954, the CIA had engineered the overthrow of Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz. The operation had combined a small force of Guatemalan exiles with psychological warfare, radio propaganda, and a handful of aging aircraft. Against all reasonable military expectations, it had worked. Guatemala became the template, the proof of concept, the institutional memory that shaped everything the CIA believed about covert operations in Latin America. Small forces, properly supported with air power and psychological operations, could topple leftist governments. There was only one problem. Cuba was not Guatemala. Fidel Castro had studied Guatemala's fall with the careful attention of a man determined to avoid the same fate. He had purged his military of unreliable officers. He had built a security apparatus capable of monitoring and suppressing internal dissent. But the men planning the Cuba operation could not see past their Guatemalan triumph. Past success had become a prison of expectations. At the heart of the tension between Kennedy and the CIA lay a fundamental disagreement about what mattered most. For Kennedy, the paramount concern was plausible deniability, the ability to claim that the United States government was not directly responsible for the invasion. Direct American invasion of a sovereign nation would shatter the fragile international consensus that held the Western alliance together. The Soviet Union would gain a propaganda victory of immense proportions. Deniability for Kennedy was not a technicality. It was the difference between an embarrassing setback and a strategic catastrophe. The CIA saw things differently. For the planners, deniability was a bureaucratic constraint, an annoyance imposed by politicians who did not understand operational realities. They acknowledged its importance in the planning documents, but beneath this surface compliance lay a deeper conviction. When the operation reached its critical moment, the president would abandon his deniability concerns and authorize the intervention necessary to ensure success. The CIA was betting that when crisis arrived, Kennedy would blink first. The invasion that reached the beaches of Cuba in April 1961 bore little resemblance to the operation originally designed by CIA planners. It had been modified, restricted, relocated, and constrained until it satisfied Kennedy's requirements for deniability while losing most characteristics that might have produced military success. The original invasion site selected by CIA planners was the town of Trinidad, located on Cuba's southern coast near the Escambre Mountains. Trinidad possessed nearly every characteristic a military planner could desire. The town itself was known for counter-revolutionary sentiment. The Escambre Mountains rose within immediate reach of the landing zone. If the invasion faltered, the brigade could retreat into the mountains and transition to guerrilla operations. Kennedy rejected it entirely. Trinidad was too spectacular. A dawn assault on a populated town could never be presented as anything other than what it was, an American-sponsored military operation aimed at overthrowing a foreign government. The alternative location selected was the Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs, a remote inlet on Cuba's southern coast surrounded by swamp. From a deniability perspective, the Bay of Pigs offered certain advantages. The area was sparsely populated. The remoteness created the possibility that the landing could be consolidated before Castro's forces could respond. From a military perspective, the Bay of Pigs was a disaster waiting to happen. The isolation that protected deniability also eliminated any possibility of popular uprising. The Escambre Mountains lay 80 miles away across terrain that Castro's forces could easily interdict. The guerrilla option simply did not exist. If the relocation crippled the ground operation, Kennedy's restrictions on air power administered the fatal blow. The original plan called for overwhelming airstrikes against Castro's air force. Air superiority was not merely desirable, but essential. Kennedy ordered the strikes reduced. Rather than the comprehensive assault that military logic demanded, the president authorized a limited strike designed to appear as defections from Castro's own air force. The cover story collapsed almost immediately. At the United Nations, American Ambassador Adlai Stevenson defended the defection story in terms that he would later discover were lies. A second round of airstrikes had been planned. Secretary of State Dean Rusk urged Kennedy to cancel the second strike. Kennedy agreed. The Cuban Air Force survived. When the invasion force reached the beaches, Castro's remaining aircraft sank the supply ships carrying the brigade's ammunition. The operation's logistics collapsed. Kennedy had not sabotaged the mission. He had preserved deniability, and in preserving deniability, he had made success virtually impossible. Given the constraints Kennedy imposed, one might reasonably ask why the president approved the operation at all. The answer lies in a myth, a carefully constructed assurance that made the operation seem tolerable even if it failed. Throughout the planning process, Kennedy was repeatedly told that the invasion carried minimal risk of catastrophic failure. If the landing did not trigger the expected popular uprising, the brigade could simply retreat into the mountains and continue fighting as guerrillas. This fallback option transformed the risk calculus entirely. A failed invasion that produced a guerrilla insurgency was not ideal, but it was acceptable. Kennedy asked specifically about the guerrilla option during planning briefings. He received assurances that the brigade had been trained for guerrilla operations. He was told what he needed to hear to approve an operation that his instincts warned him against. The guerrilla fallback was a fantasy. When the invasion site shifted to the Bay of Pigs, the geographic basis for guerrilla operations disappeared. The Escambray Mountains lay 80 miles from the new landing zone. Reaching the mountains would require the brigade to break out from the beachhead and cross exposed ground under attack from superior forces. Moreover, the brigade's training had shifted during the months of preparation. What had begun as guerrilla instruction had evolved into conventional military training. The men who waited ashore were prepared to fight a conventional battle. They were not prepared to disappear into mountains they could not reach. Kennedy had been misled, but escalation still was not an option. As the invasion collapsed, a revealing pattern emerged. The men who had planned the operation, the advisors who had assured Kennedy of its viability, all of them assumed that the president's restrictions would yield to operational necessity. The Cuba operation had been presented to Kennedy using language carefully calibrated to pass through civilian review. The Joint Chiefs of Staff assessed that the plan had a fair chance of success, phrasing that sounded moderately encouraging to a president unfamiliar with military terminology. A fair chance in military parlance suggested odds considerably below 50%. Kennedy, who had not spent a career reading military assessments, interpreted it as something close to its civilian meaning, a reasonable prospect, an acceptable gamble. Beneath the formal briefings, a quiet assumption permeated the operational planning. The president would not allow the invasion to fail when he possessed the means to save it. The bet was simple. Kennedy's fear of visible failure would exceed his commitment to deniability. When the brigade faced destruction, the president would authorize the airstrikes and naval bombardment that would snatch victory from disaster. As the operation collapsed, Admiral Burke pleaded for intervention. American destroyers could shell Castro's positions. Navy jets could establish air superiority. Kennedy listened, he questioned, and then he refused. Burke pressed again. Kennedy's response became famous. He would not authorize American intervention because doing so would put the United States in up to our necks in a war it could not control. One destroyer would require another to protect it. One airstrike would necessitate follow-on strikes. One Marine battalion would demand reinforcement. Wars, Kennedy understood, do not stay small. The final pillar of CIA optimism, the assumption that the Cuban population would rise against Castro, deserves examination because its failure illuminated the intelligence failures that had doomed the operation from its conception. American intelligence assessments of Cuban internal conditions reflected a fundamental problem. The information came primarily from Cuban exiles who had every incentive to portray their homeland as ripe for liberation. These exiles portrayed a Cuba seething with discontent, a population ready to rise, a military riddled with opposition, a government that would collapse at the first challenge. The CIA, trapped in an echo chamber of exile enthusiasm, mistook a slice of Cuban opinion for the whole. Even if broader opposition had existed, Castro's security apparatus was prepared to neutralize it before any invasion could exploit it. In the weeks preceding the Bay of Pigs, Cuban intelligence orchestrated the largest preventive detention operation in the revolution's history. Tens of thousands of suspected dissidents were arrested. The internal networks that might have supported an uprising were systematically dismembered. When the invasion force landed, the popular uprising they expected simply did not exist. The brigade fought with extraordinary courage, and they were destroyed nonetheless, not by any failure of courage, but by the fundamental miscalculation that had placed them in an impossible position from the start. In the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy was furious. He was furious at the CIA for presenting him with a plan that required escalation he had explicitly prohibited. He was furious at himself for approving an enterprise that his instincts had warned against. And in that fury, Kennedy grasped something that his advisors had failed to understand. Escalation is easier than restraint. The institutional pressures of American national security policy pushed constantly toward action, toward intervention, toward the application of military force to resolve political problems. The path to escalation was smooth and well-marked. The path to restraint was lonely and strewn with obstacles. Kennedy had walked the path to restraint in April 1961. He had refused to authorize the escalation that his advisors expected. He had accepted a visible, humiliating failure rather than risk a conflict he could not control. And in that refusal, Kennedy had demonstrated that escalation was a choice, not an inevitability. One Marine on Cuban soil becomes 10,000 when reinforcement is required. One airstrike over Havana becomes a campaign when Cuban air defenses respond. One confrontation in the Caribbean becomes a crisis in Berlin when the Soviets exercised their own options for linkage and response. Kennedy understood that wars do not stay small. They grow, they metastasize, they develop a logic of their own that overwhelms the intentions of the leaders who initiate them. He had looked at the wreckage of the operation, at the brave men dying on Cuban beaches, at the advisors demanding action, at the resources waiting just over the horizon, and he had said no. Not because he lacked the means to intervene, not because he was weak or indecisive, but because he understood where intervention led. Kennedy did not refuse to invade Cuba. He refused to start a war he could not control.